Have you ever stopped to wonder what a man deeply longs for when he fully opens himself in intimacy? It's not just about sex, touch, or physical closeness. Deep down, something far more layered unfolds, often unnoticed even by him. When people speak of male desire, the world tends to reduce it to raw instinct or physical satisfaction. But those who explore the depths of psychology, as Jung did, realize there's so much more beneath the surface. Jung taught us that every gesture, every pull of longing, has roots in the unconscious, often buried in the shadowy corners of our soul. Intimacy is that rare moment when a man lowers his guard, releases control, and lets his vulnerability show. It's like stepping through hidden doors into his private inner world. We live in a culture that trains men to always be strong, confident, and never expose weakness. Yet, in the arms of another, this armor begins to soften. It's a sacred moment where he can let himself feel, connect, and reach for something he couldn't name before. In these tender spaces, many men discover it's not just physical pleasure they seek, but a deeper craving for connection, the yearning to be accepted wholly as they are, with all their fears, emotions, and quiet longings. Free of masks and defenses, here intimacy transforms from a mere physical act into a meeting place where body and soul weave together. What unfolds between two people can awaken truths long hidden in their hearts. So let me ask you openly, what do you believe a man truly seeks when he fully surrenders in intimacy? Share your thoughts in the comments with complete honesty. If this reflection stirs something within you, leave a thumbs up and subscribe to this space. There are many soulful journeys waiting for us to explore together. Stay close, and let's keep walking this path. When Jung spoke of the language of the unconscious, he reminded us that it doesn't use words. It speaks through images, symbols, and movements. And isn't it fascinating that intimacy works in exactly the same way? The way we approach each other, how we touch, how we respond, every act carries a hidden meaning. It's no accident that what attracts us, or even what scares us, each gesture reflects a story etched deep in our psyche. In moments of intimacy, a single movement can hold an entire history. A man's silence might protect an old wound. Desires often whisper of emotional needs we never dared to voice. Many people treat intimacy as if it's something functional, routine. But Jung would likely remind us, intimacy mirrors our inner world. Not in some dreamy, mystical sense, but because what unfolds there reveals who we really are. When we drop the performance, when we stop trying to impress or defend ourselves, the unconscious begins to speak louder. You might be surprised why in some intimate relationships we feel light and genuine, while in others we freeze, gripped by shame or fear. This isn't random. These reactions are woven from our life experiences, shaped by beliefs we picked up as children, marked by wounds we never healed. And here we arrive at one of Jung's deepest insights. Whatever we haven't faced within ourselves will resurface in our relationships, especially the most intimate ones. What happens in the bedroom often acts as a message from our soul. There's something profound in male desire that few speak about, the joy a man feels when he gives pleasure. I'm not just talking about the physical act, but about something softer, almost spiritual. Many men find their deepest fulfillment in watching their partner open up, relax, and experience joy. But what does this really mean? What lies beneath this longing to give and to be present for another? These questions invite us to explore even deeper truths. Let me leave you with something to reflect on. What does it mean for you to give pleasure? What stirs inside you when your focus shifts to another's happiness? Have you ever asked yourself what this male desire to give truly represents? Not only on a physical level, but symbolically. In Jung's view, every man carries within him a feminine element, the anima. It holds intuition, emotion, care, and the ability to listen deeply. When a man connects to this inner feminine, he's no longer driven by control or dominance. Instead, he opens himself to connection, to sharing, to presence. And when he takes joy in giving joy, perhaps unknowingly, he touches that hidden part of himself, a sensitivity that longs not to conquer, but to belong. It's as though in touching his partner, he's also touching that neglected part of his own soul, the part long buried in shadow. Yet not all men are fully aware of this connection. Some act out old habits and patterns that aren't truly their own. They may seek approval or affirmation of their worth. Even so, beneath this lies something deeper, a desire to feel accepted, recognized, and important, not just to others, but to themselves. Here's where it gets even more interesting. When giving pleasure flows from authenticity, it becomes far more than a physical exchange. It becomes a sacred ritual, a silent conversation between souls. But we must pause and ask, where does this impulse come from? Is it pure, or does it hide fear, a longing for validation, a fear of not being enough? Not every act of care is born from real love. Not every gesture of generosity comes from a place of wholeness. Sometimes the drive to satisfy a partner, especially in intimacy, stems from a hidden emptiness, from chaos we haven't faced. It can look noble, a man who tries, who gives his all, who sacrifices. But Jung would ask, what truly motivates him? Is it love, or is it the ego's craving to be admired, desired, and praised? Perhaps even deeper lies an old wound, a longing to be chosen, loved, and found worthy. And when that's the case, even generosity can turn into a desperate attempt to avoid rejection. Many men unaware of their true motives easily lose themselves. They believe they're giving fully to their partner, but often they're trying to fill something missing within. This doesn't make them bad, it makes them human. But this is where the danger lies, living on autopilot. Jung once said, whatever remains unconscious will return as fate. In intimacy, this can trap us in painful cycles. A man who hasn't explored his inner world might fall into emotional dependency, mistaking it for love. He thinks he's giving himself completely, but in truth, he's losing himself, caring for another while abandoning his own needs. The ego loves to be praised, to be seen as the perfect lover, the ideal man. But real love doesn't need an audience. It simply exists. To reach it, one must walk through chaos, the chaos of unfinished stories, old absences that still hurt, and rejections that left scars. It's along this journey that intimacy changes color. It stops being a performance and becomes presence. It stops being control and becomes surrender. But this transformation asks for courage and honesty. Every desire carries both light and shadow, and it's often the shadow we try hardest to ignore. But no matter how we hide it, it will always find a way to emerge, especially when the masks fall and the body speaks what words never could. In Jungian thought, the shadow holds everything we've pushed away: feelings, impulses, memories we were taught to suppress. That doesn't make them wrong. Perhaps we were told as children that fear, jealousy, weakness, and the need for control were unacceptable. But these are part of being human, and in desire, especially sexual desire, the shadow often comes alive most intensely. Often, what excites us also scares us. What we crave in another might reflect wounds we don't even recognize. Sometimes it's not love we're seeking, but proof to ourselves that we're enough. The drive for dominance, control, or perfection in bed can spring from a hollow place, born of the belief we were never good enough. This shadow rarely shows itself clearly. It hides in fleeting reactions, careless words, and the emptiness that sometimes lingers after intimacy. Even when everything seemed perfect, Jung warned, until we make the shadow conscious, it will rule our lives, and we'll call it fate. How often do we see people drawn to the same kind of relationship, repeating the same heartbreak? How often do we do this ourselves? This is the shadow at work, pushing us into patterns until our hearts and bodies finally rebel. Intimacy then becomes the most powerful, and sometimes the most painful, mirror of all, because it touches the tenderest parts of us, our body, our sense of worth, and our fear of rejection. When we don't see our own shadow, it's easy to blame others, or even ourselves. Yet, what happens between two people often doesn't begin in the relationship. It starts deep within us. It isn't about erasing the shadow, but about noticing it. Only then does intimacy stop being a battlefield and turn into a meeting place, not of lack, but of wholeness. Desire stops screaming for attention and instead becomes a quiet affirmation of presence. Gentle, conscious, real. In every man, as Jung wrote, lives an anima, the inner woman, the soul, not in a physical way, but in a symbolic sense. The anima represents emotion, intuition, the depth of dreams. But in many societies, this side has been pushed down. Little boys are taught not to cry, told that fear is weakness, and that emotions are unnecessary. They grow up cut off from their own sensitivity, carrying an emptiness they can't name. Later, as men, they often search for this lost part of themselves in intimacy. When a man approaches another, it's not just his body that comes closer. His soul also reaches out, sometimes without him even realizing it. He is often trying to find on the outside what he has long lost within. In the second person, he projects what he once abandoned. That's why he can fall in love so deeply and intensely. It isn't just physical attraction. It's the sense that in this connection, he discovers something that felt lost. But here is the trap. What he is looking for in someone else is already his own. Tenderness, care, understanding. These are qualities of the anima. If he doesn't see them as part of himself, he will keep searching for them outside. He may expect the other person to complete him in intimacy. This often leads to idealization. The partner becomes everything, the lover, the mother, the healer, the friend, but no one can carry such an enormous weight. When this image crumbles, frustration, coldness, and disappointment often follow. This painful pattern hides something valuable. A man's deepest longing is not only for another person, it is the yearning for himself, the part of him he has suppressed, rejected, or forgotten. Intimacy then becomes an unconscious attempt to meet this hidden side through the body, through the presence of someone else. Individuation, as Jung described, is more than knowing yourself. It's about becoming whole, bringing together all parts of who you are. The light and the shadow, the strength and the softness, the logic and the instinct. Only then do we stop living out other people's patterns and finally begin to live as ourselves. Sexuality, which is often treated as separate from spirituality and emotions, is in truth one of the most direct paths to meeting our inner world. In intimacy, we show ourselves with the least control, with the fewest masks. Naked, not just in body but also in soul, we stand in our rawest form, and in this state, our deepest truths can surface. For many, sex seems like something on the side, separate from their true self. But in reality, all the things hidden in us, our fears, desires, uncertainties, and old wounds, rise to the surface there. That is why sexuality holds such power to transform. When a man begins to experience intimacy with awareness and presence, his perspective starts to shift. He stops running into the act as an escape and begins to treat it as a mirror. It's no longer about proving masculinity or playing a role. It becomes about being, about feeling what is alive inside. In this way, the body stops being just a tool for pleasure and becomes a bridge between the outer world and the inner one. Every touch can open a door, every look can unlock something, not in the romanticized sense of fairy tales, but in the real work of presence, maturity, and emotional responsibility. This is not always comfortable. It calls for courage. It requires us to face truths we'd rather avoid. It challenges what we've been taught about masculinity, desire, love, and connection. But when this inner shift begins, something changes deeply. Sexuality stops being a mechanical habit and becomes an authentic voice of the soul. Many men carry an unspoken fear, the fear of not being seen. It isn't about how they look or surface-level compliments. It's a profound need to be fully seen for who they are. From childhood, boys are told to be strong, independent, never weak. They learn to hide their emotions, to push them down, and this leaves a hollow space inside, an emptiness they cannot describe. Later, that void tries to fill itself in intimacy. This inner lack often shows up as longing. The desire for another's body often carries a deeper message. It is the soul's silent cry to be noticed, to be desired, to be heard. But this cry isn't voiced aloud. It hides in tension, in trying too hard, in the anxiety that turns intimacy into a performance. And when the response isn't as expected, disappointment, withdrawal, and distance follow. Not because love is absent, but because the man feels invisible again. The need for emotional recognition is deeply human, yet when it's unconscious, it quietly controls us. Many men spend years in relationships seeking this validation, not realizing the real emptiness lies within. The fear of invisibility doesn't disappear with flattery. It only begins to soften when a man learns to feel, to listen inwardly, to stop running from himself, and start caring for his own heart. Only then does he truly recognize himself, even the parts he wanted to hide. For many people, intimacy is still confused with physical nakedness. But true closeness begins only when we have the courage to show ourselves fully, with our history, our mistakes, our feelings that resist words. Jung reminded us that the soul doesn't speak through language but through symbols, emotions, and experiences that run deep under the skin. Few things reach as far into the soul as intimacy between two people who genuinely want to see one another, not as roles, but as beings looking through the eyes of the soul. Sexuality, though often treated as separate from emotional or spiritual life, is actually one of the clearest paths to self-encounter. In intimacy, layer by layer, we shed control, masks, and roles. In that vulnerable space, the truth, often too frightening to face, emerges. Many still see sex as only physical, as a need, disconnected from the self. But everything buried inside, fears, longings, old pain, unresolved stories, can rise there in the quiet of touch and presence. This is why intimacy holds so much potential for inner change. When a man begins to approach his sexuality with mindfulness, openness, and presence, he starts seeing himself more clearly. He starts treating sex as escape and starts understanding it as a mirror. It's no longer about proving something or acting out old patterns. It becomes about feeling, about being fully there, with all that lives inside. In this process, the body stops being just a source of pleasure and becomes a sacred bridge between outer life and inner truth. Every touch is a door. Every gaze is a key. Not in the way of romantic fantasy, but as a grounded, courageous meeting with what is real. This work isn't easy. It asks us to face what we've buried, to question what we've learned about being a man, about desire, love, and connection. But once this process starts, something deep within begins to heal. Sexuality stops being a lifeless routine and becomes an honest expression of the soul. As expected, frustration, withdrawal, and coldness often appear, not because love is gone, but because the man feels unseen yet again. Emotional acknowledgement is a human need, and when it stays unconscious, it drives us from the shadows. Many men spend years longing for this acceptance without realizing what they're truly missing is a meeting with themselves. The fear of being unseen can't be soothed by applause or external praise. It softens only when a man dares to feel, to listen inward, to see his own worth, even in the places he's tried to hide all his life. For many, intimacy still means only physical exposure, but real closeness begins when we show our entire selves, our stories, mistakes, and feelings too raw for words. Jung reminded us again and again that the soul speaks not in sentences but in symbols, emotions, and deep encounters. Few moments are as powerful as when two people meet, not as roles, but through the quiet gaze of the soul. When intimacy is entered with awareness, it becomes a mirror. It shows us what still hurts, what we've hidden, what longs to be healed. It's not always comfortable, but in that discomfort lies the power to transform. In closeness, many men first discover how far they have drifted from themselves, how tightly they try to control feelings, how often they use the body as a shield instead of a bridge, At this tender moment, naked before one another and naked before themselves, certain truths begin to rise from the shadows. Yet this transformation does not come from outside. It begins within, when a man lets go of the role he has been playing, when he stops pretending to be invincible, unshakable, always ready for anything, and allows himself to simply be a man, not perfect, but real. In this space, desire no longer feels like just hunger. It becomes the language of the soul. Intimacy no longer serves as proof of masculinity, but transforms into a sacred space for mutual listening, mutual giving, and co-creation. The body speaks where words fall silent. Silence carries answers words cannot express. Touch becomes a prayer, a gentle healing. The most beautiful part of this transformation is that it doesn't need formulas, techniques, or scientific explanations. It asks only for presence, mindfulness, the courage to look into one's own eyes, and even greater courage to let another look inside. It calls for a willingness to change, again and again. When we meet ourselves fully and when we truly meet another, it is in this willingness, this quiet presence, that real transformation begins. For intimacy, once it stops serving the roles we play and starts dissolving them, becomes a sacred ritual, a place where what is most human finally emerges. There, in shared breath and deep silences, the man who has hidden behind confidence begins to hear what he has long suppressed, and what he hears is not always comfortable. He hears his uncertainties, his softness, his hunger to be loved without conditions. He hears the fear of rejection, the ache of being unseen, but this is the essence. To hear and not escape. To stay present without judgment or fixing. Simply to be. With all that pulses, aches, and has never been given permission to rise. In this process, sexuality stops being a performance and becomes pure presence. Touch is no longer about conquering, it's about connecting. Pleasure is no longer a goal but a natural unfolding. The body, often silenced, corrected, or shamed, becomes sacred. Not because it is flawless, but because it is real, alive, whole. And when someone touches this body with deep awareness, they also touch what lies within. Stories, memories, emotions long held back. Jung once said that symbols are bridges between the conscious and the unconscious. In intimacy, the body speaks through such symbols. Shivers, tensions, openness, withdrawal. These are soul messages, waiting to be understood. But to read them, we must quiet the noise of expectations, let go of scripts, and simply feel what is there, without rushing, without masks, without shields. There is deep healing in this. When a man allows himself to be seen fully, imperfections and all, he's not just showing himself to another, he's also meeting himself. As if in the eyes of someone who accepts him, he recognizes himself for the first time, not as someone who must earn love, but as someone who deserves it simply for existing. And this experience, though it may seem small, is revolutionary. It breaks the old cycle. The cycle of a man who has spent his whole life hiding his soul to protect an image. Here, in the warmth of skin and genuine touch, something new is born. Intimacy stops being a space of tension and becomes a place of listening. Listening to the other, but also to oneself. A man who learns to hear his own body and lets his soul speak stops moving on autopilot. He stops repeating old patterns. He is no longer trapped in others' definitions of masculinity. It's a journey, sometimes slow, sometimes painful, but every step brings him closer to himself, to his truth, to his tenderness, to his anima, the inner feminine Jung described. Full of intuition, softness, and dreams. This part of him, long suppressed by culture, comes home and, when it does, everything shifts. How he looks, how he touches, how he is. A man who has embraced his anima no longer needs to prove anything. He no longer seeks closeness as a prize, he seeks it as presence. He doesn't touch to dominate, he touches to feel. He doesn't reveal himself to impress, but to be truly seen. And in that moment, he sees himself more clearly, with gentleness and wholeness. This is the true power of conscious intimacy. Not to strip us down to expose us, but to set us free. Not to reveal us for judgment, but to reveal us so we may heal. Because in truth, when we reach out to another, body and soul, we are not merely seeking pleasure. We are seeking a return to ourselves, to the freedom of being fully human without fear. This is why every real intimate encounter becomes more than just a moment of pleasure. It becomes a journey of uncovering, a slow peeling away of layers built up over years. Layers of roles, expectations, fears, and habits. A man who has been taught all his life to be strong, composed, unshakable discovers, perhaps for the first time, that he can also be tender, vulnerable, unsure. And it is in this space where he allows himself to be fully human that his real strength emerges. Strength not built on control, but on contact. Contact with himself, his body, the emotion that rises unbidden, the feeling that doesn't need to be analyzed but deserves to be felt. And sexuality is no longer a duty or a test, it is a path. A path that leads to places no logical plan or social rule can touch. And this path is not easy because it asks us to drop the armor. That armor once protected us, often for years, sometimes for a lifetime. But what was thought to be masculinity can become a prison. Only when a man dares to breathe outside of it does he truly begin to breathe. He learns that closeness need not wound, that touch need not be a battle for worth. It can be peace, silence, a quiet answer. There are no quick fixes here because each of us carries different stories, pains, and questions. But the body remembers. It remembers what the mind has long forgotten. It remembers in tensions, in numbness, in sudden desires. And when the body becomes a place of meeting, not just of action, it begins to speak. And if we listen, really listen, everything changes. Because it is no longer about being the perfect lover, meeting expectations, or chasing proof that we are enough. It becomes about simply being, with all parts of ourselves, the strong and the fragile, the known and the untamed. In this presence, sexuality becomes the soul's language, and something new is born. Something that cannot be forced or planned. The experience of being together in truth, without masks, without roles, the gaze that does not judge, the touch that does not take but listens, the presence that does not rush to fill the silence, because in the silence, the most is spoken. And when two people meet in this way, nothing else is needed. What happens is whole, even if imperfect. This journey does not end at the body. It leads inward, to the relationship with oneself. True intimacy with another begins with the courage to be close to oneself, to face one's story, to face the hurt, the ignored parts, the places longing for tenderness. Here, where body meets soul, where desire meets stillness, where control gives way to trust, healing begins. For many men, healing does not come in grand gestures, but in small moments. The breath that no longer needs to be controlled, the tear that falls without shame, the words, "I don't know," spoken without fear of failure, but as an act of honesty in closeness. This is not conquest, but meeting. Over time, each moment becomes a brick in building a new kind of masculinity, one that needs no proving, that simply is. In this raw, real space, a man stops being only the external. He is no longer a function, a role, a mask. He becomes himself, in his story, in his body, in his heart. What he sought outside all his life, love, understanding, acceptance, he begins to find within. And then, every relationship, every touch, every look becomes not a search to fill an emptiness, but an expression of presence. In this full of presence, something once thought impossible begins to emerge. The sense that he can be loved, not for what he does, but for who he is. That he can be accepted, even without the strength to pretend. True love doesn't demand perfection, it asks only for truth. And truth is not only smooth, sometimes it's rough, sometimes shadowed. but within those shadows, the light has always been waiting. The body becomes a map, not one drawn by others, but one discovered for oneself, step by step, touch by touch, breath by breath. Places that were numb come alive again. Reactions that were automatic become conscious. Relationships stop being transactions or escapes from loneliness. They become a dance, a ritual, a quiet celebration of presence. What was once knotted with tension